Probably in most of our churches, we don't spend loads of time talking about the end of the world, but that's what this reading is about today. And it's a difficult one to get our heads around because he's kind of, on the one hand, Jesus is talking about the destruction and the end of Jerusalem and the temple. And the other thing that he's talking about is the end of the world. And they are two separate things, but they're very much interwoven in the way that he speaks about them. And he uses the end of the destruction of the temple really as a lens through which you view the ultimate end of the world that's coming. And so in verse 2, Jesus is talking about the temple. In verse 3, the disciples ask, well, how do we know that this is going to be the end of, the end of the age, the end of all things, really? And then you can see, if you look at your Bible, you'll see in verse kind of 15 to 22 is very clearly talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And that actually happened in 70 AD. So that was about 40 years after Jesus was executed and rose from the dead again. Jerusalem was ultimately destroyed. There was a 4-year siege by the Romans. Eventually they captured the city. It was horrific. Even as Jesus describes it here, it was a horrific ordeal that the people went through. And in verse 29 to 30, it talks about the end of the world here. And that reminds us, to quote Michael Green, that history really is his story. It's the story of Jesus. He made the world. He came to dwell in the world. And he's telling us here that he will one day come back and he will wrap it all up. He will bring closure to the age that we're currently living in. And then in this we get little clues about, well, what's going to happen in the meantime. Jesus begins his kingdom, which breaks into our world now and which we live in today as his followers, but also the final consummation of his kingdom, the final kind of like the kingdom arrives in its completeness has not yet happened. So we live in this time of tension, and he tells us a couple of things we can expect in this time. So we can expect as his followers to be persecuted. Now in our part of the world, most of the time we get away without being persecuted in a severe sense, but many of our brothers and sisters, lots of them around the world, are being persecuted. You've probably heard of all the stuff that's going on in Iraq at the moment, and the way in which Christians are being persecuted, chased, executed. If you want to look at that more practically, go to the Open Doors website. They've got a whole load of information on persecuted Christians and how we can help them, not only by praying for them, although you can't get better than that, but also practically. So Jesus says we can expect persecution in these days, and we should expect it. And the other thing he says is we can expect people to come along who are false messiahs, false teachers. And this is where we, as people who live in the West, maybe we get caught up, not necessarily with people who overtly claim to be a messiah, but people who claim to speak for God. We can maybe get enamored by celebrity Christians and all that sort of stuff. And it's just a reminder for us to make sure that Jesus Christ is the one that we follow, him and nobody else. Keep your eyes fixed on him. He began the world, he came to dwell in the world, and one day he will return and he will wrap it all up.